Butler, and welcome back to episode 2 of the Re-Envents pre-podcast series. For these first 4 weeks, I'm throwing back the curtains of my life stage and inviting you to step into the wings and behind the stage as we walk through the dark hallways and into the dressing room of my life. This is the place where I take out my hair pieces, I pull off my fake lashes, wipe off my makeup, and put on my sweatpants. This past year has been hard. And instead of just coming back into the limelight as if nothing has changed and only a little bit of time has passed, I have been led in my heart to introduce you to the new star of the show that is no longer accepting the roles and scripts that everyone else has been handing me throughout my life, but instead, I am putting my trust in the one and only creator and asking him to guide me as I am writing my own script, directing my own show, and opening the doors of my heart to the world with restored hope, renewed faith, and resolute intention. After these 4 weeks, beginning on episode 5, we will actually begin alternating each week between a variety of 8-minute inspirational, encouraging messages and longer interview-style conversations with other individuals and entrepreneurs that have reinvented their lives and can offer a unique perspective or insight, if you will, to inspire others on their journey to find their purpose. So, if you were with us last week, then you got a quick glimpse behind the curtain of the preacher's kid, pageant girl, professional, performer, perfectionist, that has spent her entire existence putting out the image of what she thought everyone wanted to see in an attempt to control everyone's opinion of her. But when COVID took away this picture of perfection and ability to control anything, like every effort I took to control any aspect of my life was redirected, removed, or replaced with some other rule or regulation that just continued to ruin everything. Until finally there was no more business. No more calls, no more emails, no more expectations, nothing. So, with literally nothing to do, I stopped showing up for the only thing that had been receiving all of my attention, all of my focus, and really forcing me to get out of bed every morning, my event planning company, Invents. All right, now, who else is tired of hearing the word pivot? Oh my goodness, if I hear that word one more time, I may lose it. Because instead of pivoting, like I feel like every other person in the entire world decided to do whenever COVID wiped out their business or just mess with it, I decided to pivot right on into a never-ending cycle that many scholars like to call the 5 stages of grief. Now, I want to stop there and just say, like, anyone that's ever met me, like, or even maybe just worked with me, I think you would describe me as like an overall happy person. Like, I don't have a lot of bad days, like, not that anybody sees. I would say I consider myself an optimistic person, just a real positive influence, you know, a decent human being that others want to be around. I've never really suffered with depression, so when I used to hear the word grief, I immediately thought that if you were grieving, you were just really sad. And if you didn't turn it around quickly, then it could lead to depression. So, while I've certainly had my share of moments of sadness in my life, I've always been pretty proud that through any of these deaths or losses, my grief was pretty minimal. I don't know, I guess it really wasn't until a few years ago, so like 32 years old, that I actually began to learn that grief is way more than just a temporary sadness that correlates with death or losing a person in your life. But it's actually a process that includes like a variety of emotions, and it can be experienced with any type of loss, not just the death of a loved one. And some people say there's like 5, 6, 7 stages, whatever. Today, we are going to focus on the 5 main stages of that process. Now, I'd like to think that I'm like the last one to the party, like to learn this, and everybody else like, oh my gosh, yeah. But so I'll apologize in advance, just for everybody that's kind of like, oh, Jessica, you didn't know this. But just for anyone in the back who might be walking in 15 minutes late to the party with me, The 5 stages of grief in no particular order are denial, bargaining, depression, anger, and acceptance. I say in no particular order because every person is different. And while you can experience all of these stages, you may not. And trust me, there is not a perfect way to process grief. And for anyone that may have really been struggling like me, just know you can revisit any of these stages at any point. You can circle back as many times as you want throughout the process. I mean, it's never ending. It's great, right? Yeah, I think for me, it was like being stuck on a hamster wheel. Instead of like slowing down and gracefully stepping off whenever I reached the acceptance stage, it was like I had built up so much momentum that like when it was time to get off, like the wheel just kind of kept spinning. Like I kind of got pinned on the inside. It just kept going around and around and around and around. Yeah, and it can be like this for others. You know, it just keeps cycling until maybe something stops you or maybe you die. And I'm not trying to be morbid here, not by any means. But I know that there are plenty of people that I know that have passed away, you know, still angry or still sad or still in denial about something that happened many years before their last breath. But before I jump into how the 5 stages of grief really took over my life last year, I just kind of want to help you understand generally what happens during each stage. So, when someone experiences a loss and they are in denial, okay, they tend to believe that like whatever is happening cannot be happening. Like everyone is somehow mistaken and they cling to this like false preferable reality. And there's a certain peace in this stage and just that it can help us kind of survive that initial shock of the loss. But ultimately, there's this feeling or overwhelming sense of meaninglessness that you're just kind of unwilling to come to terms with. Like your life just doesn't make sense anymore if what others saying is true. So it just isn't when you're in this stage. Denial. Now, whenever someone's experiencing a loss and they're in the bargaining stage, they may understand that what is happening is real, but there's still hope that they can avoid that entire cause of grief by seeking a compromise. I'll give you this, you give me that kind of mentality. I know this is probably not the best example talking about grief, but for anyone that's ever drank to excess, you've definitely said the words like, if you'll just get me through this night, I will never drink again. Right? We've all been there. You know, if you stay my friend, I'll never talk crap about you behind your back ever again. Right? I mean, we all know what bargaining looks like. So then there's depression. Now, I feel like when I say depression, most people have an idea of what the stage looks like. I mean, the hope is gone. You're sitting at rock bottom. Even if there were a light at the top of the hole, like you're not even interested in looking up to see it. A lot of times during depression, like the reality of the situation kind of creates this dense fog. We kind of wander around and aimlessly, and it may cause us to pull away from others, feel isolated, make us refuse connection of any kind so that we can more so protect ourselves from experiencing this kind of pain again. And I know that depression oftentimes has a stigma of mental illness, but I assure you, in terms of grief, this is a very natural part of the grieving process. It's not anything that needs to be fixed or gotten over quickly. I mean, losing someone or something that is a large part of your life is a depressing situation, and it's a totally normal and appropriate response. Growing up as a preacher's kid, I didn't just spend a lot of time at church or Sunday school functions. If I wasn't at a revival or a wedding, I was at a funeral. I remember I had to reschedule one of my birthday sleepovers because of a funeral when I was in elementary school. And I really shouldn't admit this, but when I was a young child that certainly didn't understand death and loss, I actually used to get mad when people would die because no one could ever die when we didn't have anything going on. Like, oh no, they always had to pass away whenever we had something awesome scheduled, like a birthday party or a family vacation. I used to feel like we were jinxing people whenever we, like, as a family planned anything fun, because that basically meant somebody in the community was going to die. And that meant for us that my dad was going to have to go and do the funeral. Like, I don't really remember many family vacations that didn't include my dad having to drive back and forth from Myrtle Beach to spend time with us and pastor a funeral. Man, even saying it out loud, y'all, that's terrible to admit. But it's a reality when you grow up as a preacher's kid. Like, I hate to say it, but I've probably seen more funerals than weddings in my lifetime. But what growing up in this type of environment taught me is that people naturally want to help others and they don't want to see anyone hurt. So when people are depressed around them, they immediately want to fix the situation or the person. You know, is there anything that I can do for you? We've all been there. We've all said those words. And while it's not usually intentional, they can also sometimes devalue or invalidate the sadness of the situation by telling them, you know, that they shouldn't feel sad. Like, he wouldn't want it that way. He wouldn't want you to be sad. Or, you know what, she's such a loser. You're so much better off without her. You just got to move on. But if there's one thing that I've learned in this stage is that in most cases, when people are grieving or are in this stage, the last thing they need is for someone to invalidate their feelings, basically tell them what they're feeling is wrong or that they shouldn't be feeling that way. Instead, in most cases, and this is probably going to sound a little silly, but they usually need someone to give them permission to feel sad, the permission to cry, and if they've been playing the role of the strong one, the permission to feel any and every emotion that goes along with the grieving process. That is really the only way to start working towards healing. But yet, so many people dismiss this stage with this front of, you know, staying positive and moving on with their lives, and they never truly stop and sit in the sadness of the situation and just process their emotions, which usually in turn can lead straight to anger or bitterness. I actually read earlier this year in a study, Forgiving What You Can't Forget, that bitterness comes from unprocessed grief. And now, after being quite the professional griever, it makes total sense. Anger. Now I want to move into anger. Because anger can be disguised through many other emotions like frustration, irritation, anxiety, bitterness. It doesn't just mean that you're like mad and you're going to start throwing things. Like, I mean, I guess it really could mean that too. But unlike in the denial stage, when someone's experiencing anger, they're at least starting to live in that actual reality instead of that preferable reality. A lot of times people in this place are trying to find somewhere to place the blame for their pain. And that could be anyone, from their friends to their family, or even just the thing that rejected them or caused the loss. But just like in the depression stage, anger during grief is totally normal. And instead of suppressing it, like we're so often told to do throughout life, this particular emotion is very important to let out and work through as well. See, when we're depressed, we can feel like we're all alone in the world. Like there's nothing to hold on to, no one around. But anger towards something or someone could actually be the bridge that brings us back to reality and at least provides some sort of connection with others again. And lastly, we have the acceptance stage. In this place, you don't necessarily have to believe that whatever has caused you grief is now okay, but you more so begin to see that despite this loss, you're going to be okay. You've accepted the reality of the situation, and you're better able to rationalize like your state of being in a calm, retrospective way with what we'll call a stable condition of emotions. This stage should lead you to a time of healing and adjustment. I mean, you'll definitely still have some good days and some bad days, but ultimately you're just moving in the right direction. So there they are. 5 stages of grief. Who knew grief could be so complicated and involved? Certainly not me. For the majority of my life, beyond just thinking that grief was some temporary sadness, I also thought that grief was more so in relation to people in the loss of relationship or the loss of life. In fact, my counselor introduced me to these 5 stages as she was helping me process the death of my papa back in 2017. Now, just for anyone who doesn't know what papa is Southern for grandfather. So he's my papa. I had experienced some other losses in my life, but losing my papa Marshall was certainly the most devastating for me. And at the same time, in fact, less than a week after his funeral, I had to also disassociate with my dad. And for anyone that's ever known me at any time in my life knows that my dad and I have always been very, very close. He is easily one of the top 10 most important people in my life, and that still remains true even despite our current situation. But because of some differences about life choices at the time, his and mine, and after the devastation of our loss, I could no longer go on the emotional roller coaster that we'd been riding. And I just asked him to give me some time to process and to heal. So from 2017 to 2020, I've been grieving the loss of 2 very important men in my life in 2 very different ways. But this kind of grief made sense to me because it was totally natural to grieve the loss of people in our lives, right? Y'all feel me? You know what I'm saying. And I know that everyone listening to this podcast has experienced some kind of loss in their life, basically because you're breathing. So I know that you'll understand what I mean when I say that when you lose someone you love, whether that's just physically or emotionally, it's like losing a part of your heart, a part of your identity, just what makes you who you are. When that person isn't there anymore, you don't know what to do with yourself. So when I started talking to my counselor about how I was feeling after COVID had removed Re-Envents and all of its responsibilities in my life, I almost laughed in her face when she told me those were all totally natural feelings as we grieved this kind of loss. Grieve the loss of Re-Envents, an event planning company, a job. Honestly, it seemed crazy at first. But after really digging into it, Re-Envents had become so much a part of me and all the decisions that I had made, how I perceived myself, how I portrayed myself to others, how I allowed others to be a part of my life, personally and professionally, and ultimately what I considered my purpose. So when it died, suddenly, without warning, without any indication it was even sick, thanks COVID, it took a large part, if not all, at the time of my identity with it. So in looking back, I wasn't totally wrong because I wasn't necessarily grieving this inanimate object. I was grieving a person. I was grieving the loss of my purpose, my identity. I was grieving me. I was grieving the loss of the person that I knew myself to be up until that point in my life. See, when the state of emergency was first announced in March, I actually had a group canceled 24 hours before their program. And even with that happening, I thought everyone was just being melodramatic. So I had my team keep moving forward with all the projects that we were working on. I didn't even consider the fact that other programs might cancel. And when Will started the conversation with me that we may need to start looking at ways to cut costs, like trading in one of the company cars, downsizing the storage unit, moving out of the office, laying off the team. Like I refused to even have the conversation. I believe I actually said the words, "Will, I see the news. I am reading the headlines. I don't need you shoving it in my face. every time I come home and I have a chance to not think about it. I wholeheartedly believed that Will was crazy, and he had no idea what he was talking about, and he was just being overly cautious. And really, even at the end of March, when it was announced that 3 weeks was basically turning into 3 months, I was worried that if I had to lay my team off, I wasn't going to be able to get all the work done in time to be ready for this summer event season. And for anyone that hasn't picked up on it yet, that is denial. Events was gone, and by no fault of my own or anything that was within my control, but I would not accept the reality of the situation. Like, my brain couldn't even process it. Even as Will was telling me, and I was seeing all the news articles and all my clients were ghosting me and my groups were canceling, like, it just was not happening. The optimist in me, it kept saying things like, oh, well, this is good. This will give me a couple weeks to take a breath before the next wave of events comes. Like, I could really use this time to get caught up on some of these projects that I haven't had a chance to get to. Oh, this is just so wonderful. How nice. What a blessing. Yeah. But it didn't take long for some small realities to start setting in, like 1 month of $10,000 in overhead going out and zero money coming in, for me to see that I was gonna have to do something. So still, instead of pivoting, I decided bargaining would be better. I bargained with my team as I laid them off, saying oh, you'll make more money on unemployment if I furlough you now. Basically, this is better for you. Please don't hate me. And then when all these weeks are over, I'll bring you back. I bargained with the owners of my office and the storage units and the banks to defer all the payments. I mean, I actually sat on hold for 3 hours. 3 hours with Bank of America. I'll pay you, and I'll pay you in 3 months if you'll defer my payments until then, right? I bet some other people did that too. I bargained with my husband. If you just won't talk about the reality of the situation, I'll handle getting every payment deferred, so we just don't have to overreact just yet. I even bargained with the universe. Okay, I've got everything deferred and we're good for at least another month. But for real, when this next month is over, I'm gonna need some business to start rolling back in. Yeah, this stage, it actually kept me pretty busy through the month of April. I mean, 3 hours with Bank of America. But at the beginning of May, I got a call from one of my largest clients for the fall to let me know that they had already decided to cancel their program. I mean, they're an insurance company, so liability, I certainly understood it from a business standpoint. But after that call, and 2 bottles of wine and 4 old fashions and vomiting like I did when I was in college, I allowed Will a very brief conversation to tell me what we needed to do while I did the only thing my emotional state would allow me to do, which was cry. I cried when I called my team to let them know that I was not going to be able to bring them back when the initial unemployment ran out. I cried randomly in the night at the thought of not having any business. I cried when my family asked me how I was doing. I cried in bed on the morning we woke up to trade in the company cars for one we could afford. I cried in the shower getting ready. I cried the entire ride there. And then I cried through the entire process. That poor salesman, oh my gosh. I'm sure he's never seen anyone cry tears of sadness as they have leased a brand new car. Yeah, needless to say, I was depressed. And I just want to say, for the record, I am married to the most wonderful man. Throughout all this time, but especially this stage, he never told me to suck it up, get over it, get off the couch, stop playing Merge Dragons. Instead, he would do whatever he had to do for the day, and then he would just come home and sit on the couch beside me or walk the dogs with me. And if holding was required while I was crying, guess what? That's what he did. If he heard me crying in the middle of the night, instead of going to the couch so that his sleep wasn't being disturbed, he would just rub my back until I could fall back asleep. He never made me feel like I was broken, even though, y'all, I certainly felt like I was broken. But instead, he just made me feel loved and supported, and that I wasn't alone. But I hadn't given up on everything. So the day that President Trump announced the state of emergency, I had already decided that I was going to commit to a very strict diet and exercise program. Obviously, I started out strong. I did really good for the first couple months. I was a little touch and go there at the beginning of May, since apparently alcohol is not good for your diet. But when I was just crying all the time, I knew I had to get back into my healthy habits because I knew I needed those endorphins. So, with the exception of wandering around the house aimlessly playing Merge Dragons, y'all, that game is so addictive. Do not ever get started playing it. It's like Candy Crush. Because like we said it last year, those dragons, they are not going to merge themselves. So I'm just saying, you can spend hours doing it. Okay, so with the exception of wandering around our house, I prepped all my meals and I worked out every day. And other than the occasional glass of wine with dinner, or a Moscow Mule roadie for our evening walks, like I was on it. Now I know what you're thinking. Depressed. Are you kidding me? She's like over here doing these like 2 one-hour workouts a day. Like I didn't even leave my couch to eat. Well, good for her for getting into shape. But see, this is where it gets crazy. Like fast forward that routine for like 9 months. Like heck, I even started with a trainer at the end of July, and she was phenomenal. Like not just an amazing trainer, but like such an amazing influence in my life at the time, and even now. But Amanda Harris at Sky Fitness, if you're local and need a trainer. But nine months into this, and then add on a trainer, I had not lost 1 pound. I was the heaviest that I had ever been in my entire life, but I had not lost 1 pound. So I'm gonna go down a little rabbit hole just for a minute, so stay with me. In addition to not losing weight, I wasn't sleeping at all. If I could fall asleep, I couldn't stay asleep. And then I couldn't get out of bed, and if I could get out of bed, my workouts were like the only energy that I forced myself to have. And then like that was it. I was spent. I could pretty much only lay on the couch for the rest of the day. I was having night sweats. Like I couldn't remember anything. I couldn't finish my own sentences. Kept making weird, just like not like me mistakes. No libido. And this is really hard to admit. But I know many women struggle with infertility, and I am no exception. Will and I actually started trying to have a family back in 2018, and in 2019, we were blessed with a child that we lost at 6 weeks, and then another one that we lost shortly thereafter at 5 weeks. I remember being on site at an event during the first miscarriage, barely able to walk because of the pain, but showing up because my events world needed me, and but someone walked up to me and asked whenever Will and I were going to have a baby. Obviously, they had no idea. But talk about suffering silently and grieving. I mean, it literally felt like someone was stabbing me in the stomach as my body was rejecting our first child. But those words were like twisting the knife. And on top of that loss, on top of the loss of my papa, and then the disassociation with my dad. Again, I say I am intimately aware of all the stages of grief because there have been many losses since discovering this process that I've had to work through. So when we added infertility on top of all the other what we thought were just kind of normal signs of depression, it wasn't until I couldn't lose 1 pound in 9 months that we finally decided to go see a hormone specialist. Now, I'd say for probably for any woman that's ever had hormone problems, probably heard me say a lot of these symptoms and was like, girl, sounds like your hormones are off. But then you probably followed it up with like, oh, but you're too young to be having hormone problems. Now, I say that because I've gotten this a lot. So let me reassure you, at 34 years old, I didn't have hormone problems, basically because I didn't have any hormones. After we ran blood work, we did some saliva tests. We basically found that I had no progesterone, and I had the lowest amount of estrogen, DHEA, cortisol, and melatonin possible to still be considered at least in A range. Now, I know some people believe in hormone therapy, some people don't. There's lots of conversation about it. That's totally fine. But after what I've gone through with healing my hormones and experiencing what they call adrenal fatigue, y'all, I'm a believer. When I researched like what could have caused this kind of depletion, I found out, and like something that stuck with me, is that cortisol is king. When we keep our body in a prolonged elevated state of stress, it does everything it can to kind of feed that adrenaline. So if you live in the state constantly, your cortisol becomes depleted and it steals from every other hormone to be able to keep you in that like fight or flight state. Now, I have read that below doctors and lawyers and like nuclear physicists, event planning is actually considered one of the top 10 most stressful jobs. But I've never really considered it that stressful, like in a bad way. In fact, I've always kind of thought that I thrived under pressure. So the stress wasn't too much. Like it was just enough to kind of keep me on top and keep me moving and keep me motivated. What I didn't realize was that kind of mentality, my need for stress to survive in the industry and thrive, was really just kind of feeding into my body's addiction to feel that adrenaline. And when that no longer became a reality, or I should say a necessity, since there was literally nothing to do, all I had left was just a negative mindset that was an empty shell of a body devoid of all hormones and positive energy. So this kind of realization hit me probably a lot harder than it should have. But after months of being so depressed over losing this company that I had idolized and wrapped so much of my self-worth and my identity and my purpose in, to lose in a matter of a few emails with nothing to show but a mountain of debt and an overwhelming feeling of failure, now to really see what the cost of all those years of sacrifice got me, I wasn't sad anymore. I was angry. For the first time, I stopped looking at events on this pedestal of perfection. Like, I opened up my eyes to see all the areas that it had affected in my life. And I'll tell you, the one that I really thought about was my marriage. In the first year of Invents, I was laser focused on building a strong company all by myself. And I only cared about how everything in the world was affecting me. Oh, you're having a bad day? Let me tell you about mine. Oh, your dog died and now you can't work your shift? Well, I guess I'll work another 18-hour day. I've already done 5 in a row. What's another? And I will say, I was totally oblivious to the 5 stages of grief at this time as well. So as an example, when Will lost his dad towards the end of my first year in business, suddenly, like his dad checked himself into a hospital one day because he'd had some blisters come up on his legs after he had stepped into like some water with probably like a mosquito bite. Within days, the Vibrio had caused this sepsis in the blood. And within weeks, he had undergone multiple surgeries to remove both of his legs. And that was to stop the necrotizing fasciitis that comes from this Vibrio. Side note, this is why they tell you not to eat raw oysters, especially out of season. And by the end of the month, like 4 or 5 weeks later, other health problems that he'd been living with on top of this disease, it basically left the hospital with no way to treat him. And so he passed. That's why I say suddenly. But as all of this was happening, the beauty of what I do in event planning, I can do it anywhere. So I basically lived in the Marriott courtyard with Will across from the hospital for an entire month. And I rolled my office in a little suitcase into the waiting room every day. But instead of being a supportive wife and doing any one of the things that I should have to emotionally supported like his grieving process, I just continued to focus on my clients and my proposals and my contracts and my to-do list because apparently they needed me more. I was a business owner, and if I wasn't doing the work, like no one was going to do the work for me. Like Will's a chronic entrepreneur, like he understands. At least I was physically there for him. Yet these were all the things going through my mind. It hurts my heart to even remember and tell you that I was working on proposals in the room where they moved his dad to make him more comfortable in the last few hours. I actually saved my document and closed my computer minutes before I stood beside Will as he watched his dad take his last breath. That's how important Invents was at that time in my life. And really for the first 4 years. Now, that was obviously a pretty dramatic case of when I chose myself and the company over what should have really mattered. But I tell you that so you can understand and fill in the blanks of how I handled every other decision regarding priorities during the not so dramatic decisions in my life. It was moments like this that caused a huge divide in mine and Will's marriage and really every personal relationship in my life. But I won't take all the blame. I married a man just like me for qualities that we both still love so much in each other. We are strong and independent individuals working on dreams and things. Our biggest problem then was just that we weren't working on them together. So, thank goodness for an incredible marriage counselor and Will's sheer stubbornness to love me and stay married to me. We were really just putting our world back together like 2 months before the loss of my papa and the dissociation with my dad. So, out of rabbit hole, back to anger. At that moment last year, when my eyes were really opened to everything that I had sacrificed for this company, time with the ones that really mattered, hours of good sleep, years in a loving marriage, my mental state, my overall health and wellness, like anger didn't even begin to touch like the tip of the emotional iceberg that I felt. See, in denial, my internal dialogue was still optimistic, but we couldn't talk about Invents because what was happening wasn't real. Then in bargaining, I still had hope. Yeah, I was still optimistic. But we couldn't talk about Invents because I was working on things, right? I was willing, I was dealing. Like we didn't need to talk about it. Everything was gonna come out okay. But when the reality set in, I didn't want to talk about Invents because it made me sad and I hated crying all the time. I was depressed. But when I hit anger, boy, the company that shall not be named could not be talked about because I could have literally cared less if $1 million piece of business came my way. Invents was over and I was done sacrificing everything for it. In fact, I vowed to never sacrifice anything that truly mattered for it ever again. But like I mentioned earlier, I circled back through all of these emotions multiple times, and my anger wasn't always this intense. Long before I learned about my health problems, which really wasn't until about October of last year. Anger came in waves of being mad at myself for not having more money saved in the account before COVID hit. I mean, I should have been better ready, right? Clients for canceling their programs, the banks for not deferring their payments longer, Will for being unrealistic about the situation, the government for forcing the shutdown of my company, the media for controlling everyone with fear, and even God for allowing all this pain and suffering to happen to me and to the world. But throughout each of these stages, every time I visited one, my negative self-talk got worse and worse and worse. So on one of mine and Will's evening strolls to get me off the couch, I started talking about some of the things that I was feeling and thinking. And, I've always been such a self-proclaimed optimist. I confessed to Will that for the first time, like, I really couldn't find one good thing about what was going on in our lives, except that Will and I were getting to spend so much time together. Yay! Y'all, if you were married or had kids during quarantine, I mean, which was probably everybody, we all got there, you know what I mean. But it was in this talk that Will offered some healing and transition, opening up some windows to the acceptance stage. See, so many times as an optimist, we refuse to see any of the bad in a situation. But as a pessimist, we refuse to see any of the good in a situation. So sometimes life just calls for us to be a realist. He so eloquently put it to me this way. When you're standing in waist-deep poop, a pessimist will never get out because all they can focus on is how horrible and how gross and how nasty it is there. An optimist, on the other hand, will also never get out because they're just so busy talking about how great it is. It's like soft and mushy. Oh, it smells so organic. But a realist can observe the situation, recognize that they are standing in waist-deep poop. Yeah, it's not an ideal setting. It stinks. It's making things a little bit harder to walk. But a realist or a possibilist, that's what I heard it called on John Maxwell actually called it on an Ed Milet podcast, and I loved it. So a possibilist continues to move through because they can recognize that if they keep moving, there is a possibility that it can get better. There's a possibility it could get worse, but with that much poop, there's got to be a horse around there somewhere. My husband certainly has a way with words and analogies. So, with this new mindset, while I still would not allow us to talk about invents, I would allow us to talk about some possibilities to help me move forward. First, to address the question that everyone on the outside suggested, no, weddings was not an option for me. The way I like to put it gently is, it takes a special person to be a wedding planner. And Myrtle Beach has some of the finest wedding planners out there. But I am not one of them. The true answer that I gave to the insiders who suggested this option was transitioning to weddings would be like selling my soul to the devil. Like, it may solve a temporary issue, but it would only lead to long-term problems. So I decided that given my strengths in business, instead of trying to pivot inside my industry that was fighting a force well beyond our control, I decided to begin a full-time role in my hub's like insurance-based financial services company that he just did part-time. So while it was only really part-time for him, I remembered how it felt the first time that Will showed me the right tools to invest in to ensure like my future retirement, my finances, like my family was taken care of. And I wanted to share that knowledge with anyone who would listen. So I became a financial influencer for World Financial Group, or WFG. They're owned by Transamerica, but WFG also represents like over 100 different A-rated companies like Nationwide, Pacific Life, Prudential, just to name a few. And I'm still doing this today. And honestly, I'll always continue in some capacity because even if people do not see the need to invest in their retirement or long-term care or life insurance right now, one of the main focuses of WFG is financial education. And after experiencing how much the world needs more of just the basics of life finance, I don't know that I'll ever stop trying to teach everyone everything I know about it. Because doing this full-time, it taught me two very important things. One, you may have the answer to someone's problem, but you can only help people who want to be helped. Two, when we were able to actually help an individual ensure that if anything ever happened to them, like their family would be taken care of, or their legacy could be shared for generations to come, or we started an entrepreneur on their course to financial freedom, or helped a parent begin saving for their child's future, Whenever someone allowed us to do our job and allowed us to help them, we weren't just changing a person's life for a day or just a night like I was doing with events. We were changing someone's life and the life of their family forever. And for me, that's just such an incredible feeling. It was life-changing. Really, it was life-changing for me. And it was something that I'd never actually felt or experienced up until that point in my life last year. So, with that feeling, accepting what was happening in my life right then became more bearable because of the possibility that maybe my life had a bigger purpose than just planning parties for a living. It kind of became like the knot at the end of a very long rope that I was at least able to hang on to and start letting it pull me forward as I started taking small steps in any direction. Now, if I answered honestly, I would say that it's only been since maybe spring of this year that I think I truly entered into the final acceptance stage. And I only think that because last year, every time an event canceled, it was like losing the company over and over again, thus spinning that emotional wheel over and over. But this year, when that same company that canceled for the fall last year called me about May this year to let me know they were canceling again, instead of falling back into that spinning wheel of grief, my heart actually smiled. And the words that I spoke were, well, God must have a better use for my time this year. Can't wait to see what that is. Talk about a mindset shift. But as I continue to share over the course of these next weeks, I can't wait to let you know how He has been using that time. And that's where I'm stopping today. I know that there's been a lot of information about the 5 stages of grief and what those have looked like for me personally in the past year. But my hope in sharing my experiences is, if nothing else, to encourage you to take a hard look at where you are in your life right now. Last year was a big old pile of poop. Are you still standing in it? Are you spinning around in denial, trying to bargain your way out? Or maybe you're just feeling sad and alone. Are you blinded by your anger, blaming everyone else for your pain that you just can't accept any other possibility? Wherever you are on your journey, let me just take this moment to give you my vote of confidence that you are meant for something greater. There is a purpose in your life far beyond your career, far beyond what you're even capable of seeing or maybe even comprehending at this time. My hope is that my story provides you even a glimpse of what the beginning of moving into that acceptance phase can look like in your life as you work to reinvent yourself. So, thanks for tuning in. If you want to hear more, subscribe to the podcast. Find us on Facebook and Instagram at Invent Planner. That's ENVENT Planner. And feel free to reach out and share your own personal struggle with the 5 stages of grief. We would love to interact with you. So, as we increase the in crowd with intention, we want to be your source of insight, encouragement, and most of all, inspiration. Thanks for tuning in.